The Hunters in Darkness, World War II's Invisible War. May 10, 1941, 11:37 p.m. The skies over London. Flight Lieutenant John Cunningham sat in the cockpit of his Bristol Beaufighter, staring into absolute darkness above London. No moon, no stars. Thick cloud cover obscured everything. Perfect for the enemy. Below him, London was burning. Over 500 German bombers had dropped 711 tons of high explosive and thousands of incendiaries. Perfect for the enemy. Below him, London was burning. Over 500 German bombers had dropped 711 tons of high explosive and thousands of incendiaries. Massive fires erupted from the East End docks, illuminating the sky with a horrific orange-red glow. Cunningham could see the flames from 15,000 feet. But he couldn't see the bombers. That was the problem. Heinkel H-111s and Dornier Do-17s were out there somewhere in the absolute darkness, dropping bombs on targets they couldn't see, using the very fires from their previous bombs to navigate. Cunningham knew they were there. He could hear them on the radio, the deep, rhythmic drone of BMW and Junkers Jumo engines. But hearing wasn't seeing. And in 1941, if you couldn't see your target, you couldn't kill it. Then a voice crackled from behind him. Sergeant John Phillipson, his radar operator. Contact, 10 o'clock, 3 miles, same altitude. Cunningham saw nothing. The sky ahead was pitch black. But on the small radar scope behind him, Phillipson was watching a small blip of light, radio waves bouncing off a German bomber. This was new science, new technology, an entirely new way to kill. Cunningham turned the Beaufighter left, banking gently in the darkness. The aircraft's 2 Bristol Hercules engines roared steadily. He flew on instruments alone, the artificial horizon, the altimeter, the compass. Outside the canopy, there was nothing but blackness. 2 miles, Phillipson called. Still 10 o'clock. You're closing nicely. Cunningham adjusted his heading. Every movement had to be precise. Too aggressive a turn, and he'd overshoot. Too cautious, and the bomber might escape into a cloud bank. 1 mile, dead ahead now. Cunningham strained his eyes. Nothing, just darkness. Half a mile. Still nothing. Quarter mile. Should be visual any second. Then Cunningham saw it. A shadow against shadows. A darker patch in the darkness. The distinctive silhouette of a Heinkel H-11, its twin engines glowing faintly blue from exhaust heat. The German crew had no idea a British fighter was 400 feet behind them. They couldn't see it in the darkness. They couldn't hear it over their own engines. Their aircraft had no rear-facing radar, no warning system. They were completely blind to their own death approaching. Cunningham close to 200 feet. His thumb moved to the firing button. 4 20mm Hispano cannons were mounted in the Beaufighter's belly, along with 6 .303 machine guns in the wings. At this range, he couldn't miss. He pressed the button. The night exploded in fire. Tracer rounds, 1 in every 5 shells loaded with phosphorus to make them visible, streaked through the darkness. The cannon shells hit the Heinkel starboard engine. It exploded in a ball of flame. The bomber lurched violently to the right. Cunningham could see figures moving in the cockpit, silhouetted by instrument lights. The German pilot was fighting for control. The Heinkel's port engine was still running, but the starboard wing was on fire. The bomber began to lose altitude, spiraling downward in a slow, inevitable death spin. Cunningham watched it fall. He didn't follow. There was no need. The bomber was finished. At 5,000 feet, figures began jumping from the doomed aircraft. Parachutes blossomed white against the darkness. The Heinkel continued down, burning brightly now, lighting up the clouds below. It impacted somewhere in the countryside south of London. Cunningham saw the explosion. A brief orange flash on the ground, then darkness again. "Good kill," Phillipson said, quietly from the back seat. Cunningham didn't respond. He was already turning the Beaufighter back toward their patrol sector. Ground control was vectoring them toward another contact. The night was young. There were more bombers to hunt. Through September 7, 1940, the beginning of the Blitz. 9 months earlier, the night war had begun very differently. On September 7, 1940, at 5 p.m., 348 German bombers, escorted by 617 fighters, attacked London in broad daylight. It was the largest air raid in history up to that point. The bombers struck the London docks, destroying warehouses, factories, and residential areas. RAF fighters rose to meet them. Spitfires and Hercules tore into the German formations. The sky over London filled with twisting, turning aircraft, tracer fire, and falling debris. German bombers fell from the sky. British fighters were shot down by German escorts. It was exactly the kind of fight the RAF had been preparing for all summer during the Battle of Britain. But that evening at 8 p.m., the Germans came back, this time under cover of darkness. The bombers returned in waves, using the fires from the afternoon raid as navigation beacons. They dropped more bombs, creating more fires, which guided the next wave of bombers. RAF fighters scrambled to intercept them. Pilots took off into the darkness, climbed to altitude, and found nothing. They could see the fires below. They could hear German bombers overhead, but they couldn't see the enemy aircraft. The bombers were just black shapes against a black sky, invisible unless they happened to fly directly in front of a fire or a searchlight beam. Flight Lieutenant Richard Stevens of 151 Squadron flew 3 patrols that night. He spent nearly 4 hours in the air. He saw one German bomber, briefly, silhouetted against clouds lit by searchlights. He fired at it from 800 yards, saw no hits, and lost it in the darkness. 1 sighting in 4 hours. That was the problem. The night sky was enormous. London covered 600 square miles. German bombers could approach from any direction, at any altitude, between 10,000 and 20,000 feet. A single RAF fighter patrolling over London had virtually no chance of finding an enemy bomber by luck alone. It was like trying to find a specific person in a darkened football stadium while both you and the person you're looking for are running in random directions. The first night of the Blitz, German bombers flew 318 sorties over London. They dropped 330 tons of high explosives and thousands of incendiaries. They killed 430 people and injured 1,600 more. RAF night fighters shot down 0 German aircraft. 0. Not because British pilots lacked courage or skill, because they were trying to fight a battle with technology that didn't exist yet. That and 1941, if you couldn't see your target, you couldn't kill it. Then a voice crackled from behind him. Sergeant John Phillipson, his radar operator. Contact, 10 o'clock, 3 miles, same altitude. Cunningham saw nothing. The sky ahead was pitch black. But on the small radar scope behind him, Phillipson was watching a small blip of light, radio waves bouncing off a German bomber. This was new science, new technology, an entirely new way to kill. Cunningham turned the Beaufighter left, banking gently in the darkness. The aircraft's 2 Bristol Hercules engines roared steadily. He flew on instruments alone, the artificial horizon, the altimeter, the compass. Outside the canopy, there was nothing but blackness. 2 miles, Phillipson called, still 10 o'clock. You're closing nicely. Cunningham adjusted his heading. Every movement had to be precise. Too aggressive a turn and he'd overshoot. Too cautious and the bomber might escape into a cloud bank. 1 mile, dead ahead now. Cunningham strained his eyes. Nothing, just darkness. Half a mile. Still nothing. Quarter mile. Should be visual any second. Then Cunningham saw it. A shadow against shadows. A darker patch in the darkness. The distinctive silhouette of a Heinkel H-11, its twin engines glowing faintly blue from exhaust heat. The German crew had no idea a British fighter was 400 feet behind them. They couldn't see it in the darkness. They couldn't hear it over their own engines.
Their aircraft had no rear-facing radar, no warning system. They were completely blind to their own death approaching. Cunningham close to 200 feet. His thumb moved to the firing button. 4 20mm Hispano cannons were mounted in the Beaufighter's belly, along with 6 .303 machine guns in the wings. At this range, he couldn't miss. He pressed the button. The night exploded in fire. Tracer rounds, 1 in every 5 shells loaded with phosphorus to make them visible, streaked through the darkness. The cannon shells hit the Heinkel's starboard engine. It exploded in a ball of flame. The bomber lurched violently to the right. Cunningham could see figures moving in the cockpit, silhouetted by instrument lights. The German pilot was fighting for control. The Heinkel's port engine was still running, but
The Secret War, the development of airborne radar. In the summer of 1940, while the Battle of Britain raged in daylight skies, a small team of scientists and engineers at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, TRE, in Dundee, Scotland, were working on a secret project. They were trying to miniaturize radar. Britain's chain home radar network, the massive stations along the coast with 300-foot-tall towers, had proven invaluable during the Battle of Britain. They could detect incoming German raids from 100 miles away, giving RAF fighters crucial time to scramble and climb to intercept altitude. But ground-based radar had limitations. It could tell you raiders were coming and roughly from which direction. It couldn't guide a fighter to a specific bomber for an intercept. Once the fighter was airborne, it was on its own. What the RAF needed was radar small enough and light enough to fit in a fighter aircraft. Radar that could search the sky ahead of the fighter, detect an enemy bomber at several miles range, and guide the pilot to within visual range for the kill. The technical challenges were enormous. Ground-based radar sets weighed several tons and required substantial electrical power. Fighter aircraft had strict weight limits and only small generators. The entire system, transmitter, receiver, antennas, display scope, and power supply had to fit in an aircraft while leaving room for crew, fuel, weapons, and ammunition. The radar also had to work while the aircraft was moving, turning, climbing, and diving. It had to distinguish between enemy bombers and friendly fighters. It had to be reliable enough to operate in combat conditions, at -40° F temperatures at high altitude, in turbulence, while being shot at. And it had to be simple enough that a radar operator could use it in combat, in darkness, while exhausted and terrified with adrenaline clouding his judgment. The first attempt, AI Mark I, airborne interception, was tested in Bristol Blenheim fighters in late 1939. It was a disaster. The radar had a maximum range of only 3,000 feet, less than the distance at which a pilot could see an enemy aircraft on a clear day. It was heavy, unreliable, and nearly impossible to operate. AI Mark II was slightly better, but still useless in combat. AI Mark III worked on test flights but failed constantly in operational service. By August 1940, the RAF was desperate. German night bombing was intensifying. British cities were burning. And the RAF still couldn't shoot down night bombers in meaningful numbers. Then AI Mark IV was ready. It wasn't perfect. The range was only about 4 miles maximum. The display was primitive. 2 separate scopes showing left-right and up-down, requiring the operator to mentally combine them to visualize the target's position. It required an enormous external antenna array mounted on the aircraft's nose, creating significant drag and reducing speed. But it worked. In September 1940, Bristol Beaufighter night fighters began receiving AI Mark IV radar. The Beaufighter was the only aircraft large enough to carry the radar system while still having the speed, range, and armament to be an effective fighter. The problem was training. How to fight blind, the night fighter training nightmare. Radar operators weren't pilots.
They were ground crew, wireless operators, mechanics, radar technicians, given a brief course in how to read radar returns and promoted to aircrew. Most had never flown before. Many got airsick during their first flights. They had to learn to read a radar scope while the aircraft was pitching, banking, and diving. They had to learn to interpret radar returns, distinguishing between bombers, friendly fighters, ground clutter, and false signals from buildings or weather. They had to learn to talk their pilot onto an interception while both men were scared, cold, exhausted, and possibly being shot at. And they had to do all of this in absolute darkness. Pilots had to learn a different skill, flying on instruments while ignoring every instinct that told them to look outside for threats. They had to trust their radar operator completely, making blind turns and altitude changes based solely on directions called from the back seat. Turn left 10 degrees. The pilot couldn't see what the radar operator was seeing. He had to trust that the contact was real, not a false return, that the turn wouldn't put them into a cloud or into the path of another aircraft. Climb 500 feet. The pilot had to override his natural reluctance to climb in darkness, where spatial disorientation could be fatal. Many pilots suffered from vertigo when flying on instruments at night. The inner ear sends false signals. The brain becomes confused about which way is up. Pilots who trusted their instincts instead of their instruments would enter death spirals, diving into the ground while convinced they were flying level. Night fighter training killed pilots regularly. Aircraft would disappear during training flights, never to be found. Others crashed on landing, misjudging altitude in the darkness. But slowly, painfully, the RAF built up a cadre of night fighter crews who could operate the new system. By November 1940, 6 Beaufighters equipped with AI Mark I were operational. 6 aircraft to defend all of Britain. It wasn't much, but it was a start. November 19, 1940, 7:30 p.m., the first radar kill. Flight Lieutenant John Cunningham was 23 years old when he scored the first confirmed night fighter victory using airborne radar. He'd been a pilot for 3 years, but most of his experience was in day fighters. Night fighting was new to him. He'd only been flying Beaufighters for 2 months. His radar operator, Sergeant John Phillipson, was even newer to the role. He'd been a wireless operator who volunteered for radar training. He'd had maybe 20 hours of experience reading radar returns in flight. On the night of November 19, 1940, they were flying a patrol over southern England when ground control vectored them toward a contact approaching the coast. A German bomber was inbound, probably heading for London. Cunningham turned toward the intercept vector and climbed to 15,000 feet. Phillipson hunched over his radar scope, watching for any returns. At 5 miles range, a blip appeared on the scope. "Contact," Phillipson called. His voice was steady despite his nervousness. 12 o'clock, 5 miles, slightly below. Cunningham adjusted course. The Beaufighter's 2 Hercules engines settled into a steady drone. Outside, nothing but darkness. 4 miles, still dead ahead, same altitude now. Cunningham checked his instruments. Airspeed 220 miles per hour. Altitude steady at 15,000 feet. He armed his weapons, 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns. 3 miles, closing nicely. Cunningham's hands tightened on the control stick. His heart was pounding. Everything depended on the radar working correctly. If the contact was a false return, a reflection from a building or a weather pattern, they were chasing nothing. 2 miles, you're right on him. Still nothing visible ahead, just darkness. 1 mile, should be visual soon. Cunningham strained his eyes, searching the darkness. There, was that something? A shadow against the stars? Half mile, dead ahead, same altitude. Yes, there, a dark shape. 2 engines, the distinctive silhouette of a Junkers Ju-88 bomber. "I have visual," Cunningham said. He closed the range to 400 feet, careful not to alert the German crew. At this range, his cannons couldn't miss. The Ju-88 flew straight and level, completely unaware of the British fighter behind it. Cunningham centered the sight on the bomber's fuselage and fired. The 4 cannons hammered, filling the cockpit with noise and vibration. Tracer rounds streaked through the darkness, converging on the bomber. Cannon shells, each weighing several ounces, slammed into the Ju-88's port engine and wing root. The port engine exploded. Flames streamed back from the cowling. The bomber rolled left, began to dive. Cunningham didn't follow. He pulled up and away, watching the bomber fall. It was doomed. No one survives a burning crash from 15,000 feet. The Ju-88 went down somewhere in the English countryside. All 4 crew members were killed. First confirmed night fighter victory using airborne radar in combat. The system worked. It actually worked. When Cunningham landed back at base and climbed out of the cockpit, his hands were shaking. Not from fear, from the realization that they'd just proven a new way to fight. A way to see in darkness, a way to kill invisible. Within weeks, more bow fighters were being equipped with AI Mark IV. Within months, specially trained night fighter squadrons were operational. The hunters had arrived.
December 1940, May 1941. Learning the night hunter's trade. The early months of night fighting were brutal for both sides. German bomber crews continued to suffer low losses. Most nights, less than 1% of attacking aircraft were shot down. They bombed British cities almost with impunity, knowing British night defenses were still largely ineffective. But slowly, incrementally, that began to change. Flight Lieutenant Richard Stevens of 151 Squadron scored his first radar-assisted kill on December 15, 1940. He would eventually become one of the RAF's top night fighter aces with 14 confirmed victories. Flight Lieutenant Charles Widows scored 2 kills in one night on January 15, 1941, a rare achievement that demonstrated the potential of radar-equipped fighters. John Cunningham continued to add to his score. By May 1941, he had 6 confirmed kills, making him the leading night fighter pilot in the RAF. But every victory required perfect coordination between pilot and radar operator. If the radar operator misread the scope or gave incorrect directions, the interception failed. If the pilot didn't follow instructions precisely, they'd lose the contact. And the radar itself was still primitive and unreliable. AI Mark IV had a minimum range of about 400 feet. That meant once the radar operator guided the pilot to within 400 feet of the bomber, the contact would disappear from the scope, lost in ground clutter or the radar's blind spot. At that point, the pilot had to visually acquire the target. If there was cloud cover, or if the bomber blended into the darkness, the interception failed, even though the radar had done its job perfectly. The radar also couldn't distinguish between friend and foe. If a British bomber was returning from a raid over Germany, the radar would see it just like a German bomber. Night fighters had to be extremely careful about identification before firing. Several British bombers were shot down by friendly night fighters. The incidents were classified, kept secret to avoid damaging morale, but they happened regularly. Night fighting was dangerous for everyone. German crews, British crews, and British night fighter pilots who were as likely to die from accidents, equipment failures, or friendly fire as from enemy action. The night belonged to no one. Everyone was fighting blind. May 10 to 11, 1941, London's longest night. The night of May 10 to 11, 1941 would be remembered as the worst night of the entire Blitz. Over 500 German bombers attacked London in waves from 11 p.m. to 5:30 a.m. They dropped more than 700 tons of high explosive bombs and countless incendiaries. The London docks burned with such intensity that the glow could be seen from 100 miles away. Firefighters described walls of flame stretching hundreds of feet into the air.
The heat was so intense, it melted glass and ignited buildings on the opposite side of the Thames through radiant heat alone. Westminster Abbey was hit. The debating chamber of the House of Commons was destroyed by a direct hit from a 500-pound bomb. The British Museum, the Tower of London, the Royal Mint, all were damaged. Residential areas were devastated. Entire streets ceased to exist. Over 1,400 people were killed. Another 1,800 were seriously wounded. Thousands more were injured by flying glass, falling debris, or trauma from near misses. The RAF scrambled every available night fighter. John Cunningham and his radar operator John Phillipson were airborne by 11:15 p.m. They flew patrol over London, directed by ground control toward the densest concentrations of raiders. At 1:30 a.m., Phillipson picked up a contact on radar. They pursued, closed the range, and Cunningham destroyed a Heinkel H-111 with a short burst of cannon fire. One bomber out of 500. They returned to base, refueled and rearmed, and took off again at 3 o'clock a.m. Another patrol, another contact. But this time, they lost it in clouds before achieving visual acquisition. They landed again at 5 a.m., exhausted, having flown 2 combat missions in one night. Other night fighter crews had similar experiences. Squadron leader James Wheeler shot down one DO-17. Flight Lieutenant Richard Stevens destroyed one H-111. A few other pilots scored probables or damaged. In total, RAF night fighters shot down fewer than 10 German bombers that night. Less than 2% of the attacking force. It wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough. But it was more than zero. And crucially, it was sustainable. The night fighters weren't getting wiped out. They were learning, improving, becoming more effective with each mission. The Germans, meanwhile, had achieved their maximum effort. Over 500 bombers in one night was the absolute limit of the Luftwaffe's capacity. They couldn't sustain that level of attack. And, unknown to everyone flying that night, the raid on May 10 to 11 would be the last major attack on London. 3 days later, on May 13th, Hitler issued orders for most of the Luftwaffe to redeploy to the east. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was being planned. The aircraft were needed elsewhere. The Blitz on Britain ended not because Britain's defenses had defeated it, but because Germany chose to fight a different war. Still, the night fighters had proven their value. They'd shown that night bombers could be intercepted and shot down using radar. They'd bought time. They'd learned lessons that would be crucial in the years ahead. Because the night war was far from over. It was only beginning. June 1941 to December 1941. The pause. After the intense bombing of the Blitz, the summer and fall of 1941 were relatively quiet over Britain. German raids continued, but they were smaller, perhaps 30 to 40 bombers instead of 300 to 400. The targets shifted from London to other industrial cities, Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham. RAF night fighter squadrons used the lull to train and improve. New pilots and radar operators cycled through operational training units. Tactics were refined. The AI Mark IV radar received upgrades, better display scopes, improved antennas, more reliable components. More B fighters entered service. By the end of 1941, the RAF had perhaps 100 operational night fighters, compared to just 6 a year earlier. The success rate improved dramatically. In early 1940, night fighters scored 1 kill for every 100 sorties flown. By late 1941, the rate was 1 kill for every 30 sorties. Still not great, but improving. John Cunningham continued to add to his score. By December 1941, he had 12 confirmed victories, making him one of the highest-scoring night fighter pilots in the world. His success earned him a new nickname, Cat's Eyes Cunningham. The story was published in newspapers across Britain. Cunningham had exceptional night vision. He could see German bombers in conditions where other pilots saw nothing. His secret? He ate lots of carrots, which improved his eyesight. The Ministry of Food seized on the story. propaganda posters appeared encouraging British citizens to eat carrots to improve their night vision. Carrots keep you healthy and help you see in the blackout. It was all a cover, of course. Cunningham's success had nothing to do with carrots and everything to do with radar. But the cover story served two purposes. It explained Cunningham's success to the public without revealing classified information about radar, and it helped maintain morale by suggesting British pilots had natural advantages over German aircrews. The Germans knew the British had some form of night fighting capability. They knew British fighters were shooting down bombers more frequently, but they didn't know the source of that capability. German intelligence analysts debated whether the British had developed new tactics, better training, or some kind of technological advantage. Some suspected radar, but couldn't confirm it. The carrot story, absurd as it seems in retrospect, helped maintain operational security around one of Britain's most important secret weapons. Meanwhile, on December 7, 1941, everything changed. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. America entered the war. Within days, Germany declared war on the United States. The war that had been Britain standing alone against Germany was now a global conflict. And with American entry came new challenges and new opportunities for both sides.
1942. The tide begins to turn. In 1942, RAF Bomber Command intensified its own strategic bombing campaign against Germany. Under the leadership of Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, the RAF began launching massive night raids against German industrial cities. In May 1942, the RAF launched the first 1,000 bomber raid against Cologne, 1,047 aircraft attacking a single target in one night. The strategy was simple: overwhelm German defenses through sheer numbers. Even if German fighters and flak shot down 5% of the attacking force, 950 bombers would still get through to drop their bombs. But 5% losses meant 50 aircraft destroyed. That was 350 aircrew killed or captured in a single night. The math was brutal, and Germany was developing its own night fighter force. German engineers had been working on airborne radar in parallel with the British. The Liechtenstein radar system was bulkier and less sophisticated than British AI radar, but it worked. By mid-1942, German night fighters, primarily Messerschmitt Bf-110s and Junkers Ju-88s converted from day fighters, were being equipped with Liechtenstein radar and deployed to special night fighter units called Nachtjagdgeschwader, NGG. The most famous German night fighter pilot, Major Helmut Lent, scored his first radar-assisted kill in August 1941. By the end of 1942, he had over 40 night victories. Oberleutnant Heinrich Prinz zu Wittgenstein, another top German ace, developed tactics for using radar to intercept RAF bomber streams. He would position his fighter in the path of incoming bombers, use radar to detect them at maximum range, then vector onto an intercept course. German night fighters began taking a terrible toll on RAF bomber crews. The technology that had saved Britain in 1940-1941 was now killing British airmen. On the night of November 18-19, 1942, RAF Bomber Command launched a raid against the Fiat Works in Turin, Italy. Of 232 aircraft dispatched, 11 were lost, a 4.7% loss rate. Most were shot down by German night fighters operating from bases in southern Germany. 4.7% might not sound like much, but RAF bomber crews had to fly 30 missions to complete their tour. At a 4.7% loss rate per mission, the statistical probability of surviving a 30-mission tour was approximately 25%. 3 out of every 4 bomber crewmen would be killed or captured. Those were the odds facing every 19-year-old kid who climbed into a Lancaster or Halifax bomber. 1943, the height of the Night War. By 1943, the Night War had escalated into a technological arms race where each side's innovations spawned countermeasures which spawned countermeasures. In March 1943, RAF Bomber Command launched a sustained campaign against the industrial cities of the Ruhr Valley,
the industrial heartland of Germany. Night after night, hundreds of bombers struck Essen, Duisburg, Dortmund, and other cities. German night fighters responded in force. The Nachtjagdgeschwader developed a new tactic called Himmelbett, a system of ground-controlled interceptions where radar stations would direct individual night fighters to specific bombers. The system worked frighteningly well. On the night of March 30-31, 1943, RAF Bomber Command lost 38 aircraft out of 329 dispatched in a raid on Nuremberg, an 11.6% loss rate. It was unsustainable. Then, in July 1943, the British deployed a new countermeasure, window. Window was strips of aluminum foil cut to specific lengths to match German radar frequencies. When dropped in massive quantities from bombers, window created thousands of false radar returns, completely overwhelming both ground-based and airborne radar. On the night of July 24-25, 1943, RAF Bomber Command launched Operation Gomorrah, a massive raid on Hamburg. For the first time, window was used on a large scale. Over 92 million strips of foil were dropped during the raid. German radar screens went completely blind. Controllers couldn't track individual bombers. Night fighter pilots couldn't find targets on their airborne radar. Ground-based flak units fired randomly at clouds of false returns. The bomber struck Hamburg almost unopposed. Major Hajo Hermann, a German night fighter ace, flew 4 sorties that night. His radar was useless. He never saw a single British bomber despite flying through the bomber stream multiple times. The raid killed an estimated 42,000 people in Hamburg in a single night. A firestorm developed that consumed entire neighborhoods. The death toll exceeded the total British deaths from the entire 8-month Blitz. Window had completely neutralized German radar defenses. But the Germans adapted. Within weeks, German controllers developed new tactics. Instead of relying on radar to vector individual fighters to individual bombers, they used running commentary from ground observers to direct large numbers of fighters to areas where bomber streams were concentrated. The tactic was called Zame Saal, tame boar. Controllers would broadcast continuous updates. Large concentration of enemy aircraft over map square Gustav Heinrich. All fighters proceed to that area. Night fighters would fly to the designated area and hunt visually, using the glow of target markers and fires to spot silhouetted bombers. It wasn't as precise as radar-directed interceptions, but it worked. German night fighter kill rates, which had dropped dramatically immediately after window was introduced, began climbing again. The seesaw continued. British bombers began carrying Monica, a rear-facing radar that warned crews when a German fighter was approaching from behind. It gave British gunners precious seconds of warning before an attack. German engineers responded by developing Flensburg, a detector that homed in on Monica's radar transmissions. German night fighters could follow Monica's emissions directly to British bombers. When British intelligence discovered this, Monica was ordered turned off on all bombers. The system that was supposed to save lives was getting crews killed. German night fighters deployed Schräge music, upward-firing cannons mounted at an oblique angle. A night fighter would position itself underneath a bomber, invisible to the defensive gunners, and fire upward into the bomber's fuel tanks and bomb bay. British bomber crews had no defense against it. They would just suddenly explode, torn apart by cannon fire from below, where they had no guns to shoot back. The RAF developed Surratt, a device that detected German night fighter radar emissions and allowed British night fighters to hunt the German night fighters that were hunting British bombers. And on and on. Every move had a counter-move. Every innovation spawned a counter-innovation. The night war was no longer about bravery or skill. It was about technology. And about young men dying in the darkness while their governments raced to develop the next advantage. The Mosquito, the perfect night fighter. By late 1943, a new aircraft was revolutionizing RAF night fighter operations, the de Havilland Mosquito. The Mosquito was extraordinary for what it was made of, wood. While other aircraft were constructed of aluminum and steel, the Mosquito was built from plywood and balsa wood, laminated together in a careful process that created a structure that was light, strong, and, crucially, nearly invisible to radar. Wood doesn't reflect radar waves the way metal does. A Mosquito approaching a German bomber was almost undetectable on the bomber's rear warning radar. The Mosquito was also fast. With two Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, it could reach 370 miles per altitude, faster than most German bombers and faster than German piston engine fighters. It was armed with four 20mm cannons and four .303 machine guns mounted in the nose, giving the pilot tremendous firepower without needing a gunner. And it was equipped with the latest AI-10 radar, which had double the range of the earlier Mark IV and much better resolution. Most importantly, the Mosquito had range. It could escort British bomber streams deep into Germany, patrol for hours, engage multiple targets, and return home. John Cunningham transitioned to Mosquitoes in mid-1943. He immediately noticed the difference. The B fighter had been heavy, stable, but sluggish. The Mosquito was light, responsive, almost like flying a day fighter. But it had the range and equipment of a night fighter. It was the perfect combination. On his first combat mission in a Mosquito, Cunningham shot down two German bombers in one sortie, both Ju-88s that never knew a British fighter was hunting them until cannon shells tore through their fuselages. By the end of 1943, Cunningham had 15 confirmed night victories.